Thank you very much, and good morning from the USA. It's a beautiful fall day here, and I'm delighted to join you. I'm going to be introducing you, as you heard, to the Schoolwide Enrichment Model. I've worked on this with my colleague and partner, Dr. Joseph Renzulli, for the last 40 years, so we've been at this a long time, and I'm delighted to have a chance to meet with you. The Schoolwide Enrichment Model was developed in the 1970s and 1980s. Next slide, please. It's widely used across the United States and the world. On this slide, you'll see some of the countries in which the model is being used. We don't charge or license the Schoolwide Enrichment Model, so we don't always know how many places it's used, and it is used in many different ways. So one way that it's used is as a gifted program model. That's very common, but it's also used as a school-based theme model. So there are schools that are based on the Schoolwide Enrichment Model, and they call themselves magnet schools, enrichment schools. And again, these are very, very widely placed across the world. We have lots and lots of schools in Europe, many in Germany, many in Switzerland, and it's something that's become very, very popular. Next slide. It's part of the reason that it's become popular is because it has been, and just click forward, please. It has been used, as you'll see, in many different ways. It's also got over 40 years of research on the model. So there have been hundreds of studies done, not just by Joe Renzulli and I, but by others. And our website on this is all of everything that's available is downloadable. You can translate it, and we're consistently adding articles and information to the website when we get various types of products from schools. Next slide. The Schoolwide Enrichment Model is based on Renzulli's three-ring conception of giftedness. So if you've read any textbook in gifted education, you will have heard of this. It is that Joe learned many years ago through his research that when we define giftedness, we can't just look at people that are in the top 2 or 3%. We have to continue to look at individuals that are potentially slightly below that top 5% if we really want to see people that are going to be highly creative. So this is a definition of giftedness focusing on creative productivity. And you'll see several examples of that in my presentation today. So creative productivity, what we find is that gifted behaviors that are highly creative and productive happen when three clusters of abilities come together. The first is above average ability. The second is creativity. And the third is the development of task commitment. And these happen not necessarily in only the top 5%, but also not in all students. And that's what the atom in the upper right-hand corner depicts. They happen in certain people, in certain students, at certain times and within certain circumstances. And I'll talk a little bit about that. We call this the development of these three rings. That's hence the three-ring conception, creative, productive giftedness. Next slide, you'll be able to see, again, many examples of creative, productive giftedness as we move forward. That's the atom. And the next slide, what you'll see is that there's 2 students here as an example of creative, productive giftedness, and I'm going to give you many, many other examples. Next slide. So here's one from Mexico. We've worked in Mexico for many years, and it's a very interesting thing to work with many, many young people from various places across the country, because after 40 years of working with gifted and talented students, what we've learned is that so much about talent development is based on interests. We also take a problem-based approach. So this is a young girl that was at an enrichment program at her school. She comes from a very poor village. Her name is Chachki. And the very poor village that she comes from did not have hot water. And you see that there's a happy ending to this story because she's holding for you a certificate from a university. But the story is that she decided she wanted to try to develop a solar water heater. And so she worked for months and months and months with her teacher to develop a small protocol of a solar water heater. And so as she did this, her teachers were very impressed with her task commitment, her creativity emerged, and she certainly was above average. Her teachers arranged for her to meet with somebody at the university who was an engineer, a solar engineer. Next slide, and look what happened to her small invention. Her small invention, with the help of a mentor, turned into, for under $10, discarded water bottles, an old window, and an old garden hose, turned into a solar water heater large enough to heat hot water for her family, her two siblings, her mother and father. So they were able to have hot water in their small apartment. When her mentor said, "Do you want to patent your invention?" she said, "No, I want to give it away. I want everybody to be able to have hot water." And this is the idea behind creative productivity, and also the idea behind the school-wide enrichment model. In the school-wide enrichment model, we have 3 services, and you'll see that in just a minute. And these services can be given to all students, so it's not restrictive. Generally, the most advanced level, which is type 3 enrichment, which is this, students working on creative projects, oftentimes to solve problems. This most advanced level is reserved for students that are more above average, but we don't always know who those students are. So next slide. In the next slide, you're going to see an example of identification. And I am a specialist. Could you click once more, please? I'm a specialist in twice exceptional. So on the slide, you're going to see the names of some very famous people. And I just want to make sure that you understand that none of these people would have qualified for gifted programs if we use the top 5%. Many people still believe that we need to identify and it's going to be limited to a certain number. My husband and partner, Joe Renzulli, and I believe that we create and develop giftedness in a broader segment of the population. So let's look at a couple of these people. You see Richard Branson, who has twice exceptional dyslexia. Below Richard Branson, you see a very famous American woman named Temple Grandin, who is autistic and never would have been involved in a gifted program. So they are both from the special education population. You see a very famous American poet. You see Thomas Edison, and on the
Excuse me,
bottom,
Dr. Reis, could you speak a little slower? A little slower.
Okay. You see Thomas Edison. You see Steven Spielberg, and Maya Angelou. None of these individuals would have been placed in a gifted program if we focused primarily on just on test scores or aptitude scores. So that's some of the background of the 3-ring conception of giftedness and of the school-wide enrichment model. Now, in the next slide, you'll see an overview of the school-wide enrichment model. And in the overview of the school-wide enrichment model, you will see the 3 services. So we're going to click through the front of the cube, and these are the 3 services. The first service, would you just keep clicking through till you get all of the slides up, please? In the first service, you're going to see that we want to take a look at strength assessment. In the second service, we want to differentiate or compact curriculum. In the third service, we want to provide a healthy dose of enrichment for all students. So these are the 3 services down the face of the cube. First is looking at strengths and interests. Second is looking at curriculum to see if we can modify it. Third is looking at how we can provide enrichment for all students. These are applied to 3 things. Up on top, the regular curriculum, A healthy dose of the regular curriculum could be enriched for many students. Second, a series of opportunities we provide in the school-wide enrichment model called enrichment clusters, which are once a week opportunities for all students to become involved in enrichment in the school, led by all teachers. And the third is after school programs, things that happen at home, Saturday programs, etc. The next slide tells us a little bit about the goals of school-wide enrichment, which are that we want to provide, next slide, please. We want to provide enjoyment, engagement, and enthusiasm for learning. Enrichment should stand for these three things. Students should enjoy it, they should be engaged in it, and they should be enthusiastic about it. In the next slide, you'll see a summary article of 4 decades of research on the school-wide enrichment model, and I will provide that to the conference organizers so you have a copy of it. But this shows how much research has been done by how many people, and I think you'll see what I mean when I say it's been very broad research. Now, over the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen a lot of expansion of our work, and there are a few new directions. One of the directions is that it's being used very, very often for twice exceptional students. In a studies that I've been working on at UConn, we've been studying high achieving students with autism, and we look back at their school experiences that made a difference. And we hear over and over again, projects, interest-based activities. And so on the next slide, we just summarize a few new directions in the SEM. And these include, as I said, things like a focus on talent development. If I might be so bold, I would say that the work that Joe Renzulli and I have done has been at the forefront of the movement towards talent development. We believe that gifts and talents can be developed and that school should be the place that we do this. So let's now very, very briefly go over the 3 areas in the school-wide enrichment model. In the next slide, you'll see a schematic of a total talent portfolio. And this total talent portfolio simply means that we're going to create a portfolio for students whereby we keep and we nurture their strengths. So we look at their interests. Next slide, we have them fill out brief forms that tell us about the ways they like to learn, how they learn best, the things that they enjoy doing. On the next slide, you'll see a profile that's done with a computer, and you can try this for free if you'd like. This is Renzulli Learning. It's a computerized program to be able to identify student interests, the ways they like to learn, and the ways they like to express themselves. The idea is that we want metacognitively, we want students to understand themselves, how they like to learn, what they enjoy doing, the kinds of things that make them happy, the kinds of products that they like to do. And these are all critically important. So that's the first goal, looking at interests. Go ahead and click through a few of these because there's some supply-ins. So we look at interests, we look at the ways they like to learn, and now we're back to the SEM again. And so the second, next slide, the second major, thank you, and you can just click through until all of the things are up. The second major service, after looking at strengths, the strength assessment, and again, if you want to try our electronic system for doing this, it's we have a system. It's free trials. You can just go to renzullilearning.com. The second major goal service in the school-wide enrichment model is curriculum compacting. And this is where we look at the curriculum. Let's just have you click through 2 slides. We'll skip the next one. 2 slides, please. We actually have them look at the curriculum and determine, this is the compactor form, and click again, please. The first column what we do is we name these, this is for our most academically advanced students. What are these students' strengths? What are the areas that they should be considered to have their curriculum differentiated or compacted? Second slide, we then prove it. We document these strengths. So we name the strengths, we document the strengths, and then we change the strength. We change it. And in this case, this is probably one of the most well-known differentiation methods. Carol Tomlinson, who we worked with in the 80s, when she wrote her book on differentiation, this is one of the methods that she mentioned. It's been around for a long time. The research on it is very, very clear. We can eliminate 40, 50% of very bright kids' curriculum once we find out what they're good at. So in the next slide, what we have is a little bit of an overview of enrichment teaching and learning. And now we come into the part of the SEM that's so very well known, and that would be the next slide. That is the opportunity for type 1, type 2, and type 3 enrichment. 3 types of enrichment, and that would be the next slide. This is the enrichment triad model. And again, you'll have a copy of these 3 types of enrichment, and I'll be going through these in the next part of the presentation. Type 1 enrichment is exposure to new ideas, new things. For some of you today is a type 1 exposure. It's exposing students to things that they might want to learn more about and doing it in an exciting, innovative way. Type 2 enrichment, which we'll also introduce briefly, is training and processing skills. And then type 3 enrichment is what you already saw, the little girl from Mexico that built the solar heater. That's project-based learning, investigation of real problems. So let's take a closer look at type 1 enrichment. Next slide. In type 1 enrichment and type 2 enrichment, we try to provide enrichment for all students. So again, type 1, type 2 for all students. In the next slide, you'll see some examples of type 1. It might be a virtual field trip. It might be a real field trip. It might be bringing a speaker into class. It might be introduction of a new book. Think about this. If students are in school for 150 days, and in the USA, students are in school for 180 days. If we expose them to a new book, 5 minutes of a new book and a new author every day, at the end of the year, they'd be introduced to 180 new books. Now, they wouldn't remember all of them, but they might find one of those books in which they have a sincere interest in going further. So type 1, next slide, as you'll see from these slides, can be done by showing students photographs. It can be done by bringing in speakers. In the next slide, you'll see a couple of speakers that came in to classrooms. One is an elderly gentleman talking about local history. In the next, or the slide next, and the photo next to him is a woman engineer talking about robotics. Both of those are type 1 experiences. Next slide. In the next slide, you'll see 2 local architects coming in and speaking about architectural programs in the city. Next slide, please. Thank you. You'll see 2 local architects. And in this case, you see students that are very motivated, excited to be there. And in the next slide, you'll see one of the many ways that we can provide type 1 now using the internet. This is NASA in the United States, our space program. And NASA does a webinar for students once a week where they have a type 1 built in. So students that are interested in space, interested in aeronautical engineering, can actually attend webinars by NASA in the US. So these are all opportunities for type 1s. Next slide. In the US, some teachers create interest centers if they have a lot of students interested in something like medicine or in this case, anatomy. And in those, they might actually have task cards. Okay, we're going to skip the next slide and go right back to the triad model. So moving forward, type 1 then is exposure. Type 2 is training. So training, next slide, please. And then the next one, we're going to skip this one because of time. Training. So we're back to the enrichment triad model. So the goal of this is in many ways to be able to expose students and then provide them with training. So let's look at some type 2 skills. In the next slide, you'll see and again, you'll have a copy of these slides. You'll see the kinds of skills in our type 2 taxonomy that are provided for students. We want to give them opportunities for cognitive thinking skills, such as creative thinking, critical thinking. We want to teach them learning how to learn skills. We want to provide them with skills in technology that are realistic and that teach them how to use multiple sources. We want to give them some opportunities to learn better communication skills and project management skills. And these are all things that are important for students who are going to pursue more advanced work. In the next slide, you'll see some sample activities that are very popular in the US. And these are areas, again, such as next slide, please, creative thinking, critical thinking skills, online activities. And this is one kind of type 2. The second kind of type 2 is more specific to areas that students are investigating. So think about the little girl, for example, that was working on the solar water heater. It's really important for her to learn research skills, really important for her to understand creative thinking and critical thinking, but she also had to learn how to build a solar water heater. So there's a different kind of type 2, and we call that methodological training. So in methodological training, what we're doing is teaching students the methods of how a practicing professional works. So how to do a research project. And this is one about composting, which is very, very big in the US right now. So it's really important for students in particular these days to learn research skills and critical thinking. And the next two slides are just an example of why we have to do this. So in the US, some research was done on creating a fake website about a tree octopus. Go ahead and click again, please. And the tree octopus, what you'll be able to see, is that researchers created a scam, something that wasn't real, and sent thousands of kids to this site to say that there was an endangered animal called a tree octopus. If you think about this, it makes no sense because, of course, octopi can't live on trees. So the idea would be that students would have checked at least one other source, but of course they did not. And so what they learned, next slide, from the researchers learned, is that we have to teach students how to be very good consumers of information. You know from the news what's happening with fake election news in the US. We have to teach people that they can't just look at one source and believe it to be true. And so this is also a part of what we call type 2. Next slide. In the US, we have some very, very great opportunities for type 2 training. So for example, we have a program called Future Problem Solving that some of you could start in your country if you were interested, in which students identify a real problem in their society and then try to solve it. And they do this in groups and teams from their school. And then there is a conference where they all come together, and it teaches students something that's very, very important in the school-wide enrichment model. And that is that we should use our talents to solve problems in our community, our neighborhood, our town, our country, our world, that talents are important for solving problems. And when we do this, we can make this world a better place. And that's a little bit about type 3. So next slide, please. Type 3s, the most advanced part of the enrichment triad model, involve research skills, interest-based activities. Students write books. Next slide. They're always, always, always based on student interests, as you'll see. in the next slide, always based on student interest. So in schools that use the school-wide enrichment model, we see students as young as first or second grade working on interest-based problems and projects. And you saw this. They enable students to be able to work on long-term opportunities. They bring depth and complexity to students. And most importantly, they're based on student interests. So, and you've seen the next two slides again. You saw Chachki. Next slide, the little girl from Mexico. And this is an exactly perfect example of a type 3. Next slide, she looked at a problem in her community. She used critical and creative thinking to solve the problem. And we have many, many, many examples of these. I'm going to just go through a couple more with you so you have a sense. Type 3 projects can be done either by students on their own individually or in small groups. This next example, click ahead, is about a young man named Brooks, a young boy named Brooks McConnell, that saw a podcast about a guy named Sam Burns. And you'll see Sam in just a minute. But Sam had a disease called progeria, which is rapid aging. And Sam did not live to his 20th birthday. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see a great photograph of Sam soon before he died. And in this podcast that this young man heard of Sam, and here he is. This is Sam at 17 years old when he died. Sam said he'd lived a very happy, happy life. And he said also that in his happy life, he didn't have too many regrets. But one of his regrets was that he'd never been able to ride a roller coaster. And so Brooks from West Hartford, Connecticut said, there must be a way that Sam can learn to do this. And so many wonderful examples of students identifying real problems. Now we're going to run through the next two slides fairly quickly. You're going to see Brooks working on on this roller coaster problem. He had to learn to videotape being in a roller coaster. He had to learn about engineering. He had to learn about vibrations. Next slide. He wrote to roller coaster companies and got information. He spent a year developing a simulated roller coaster ride. And look at the how-to books that he used. So in so many ways, this opportunity for him, and then you see him trying, next slide, trying his invention, sitting in the chair, making sure it wasn't too hard to do for Sam. And then he is at the end of his school year. Next two slides, you can just go through the slides. Yeah. Here he is at the end of the school year with his prototype. And here he is at the school type 3 fair that they have every year with his project. And then he didn't stop there, but he wrote to roller coaster companies and said, there's lots of people with disabilities. I think you should have my roller coaster project at every park that uses your roller coaster. At last slide. And so that shows you again how he moved forward in this. Next two slides, please. So here's the letter he sent to roller coaster companies. Although Sam never got to try it because he died during that year, he sent a letter to Sam's mother explaining what he had done in his name. So here you see so many of these opportunities. You'll see another example of type 3, and we're going to move through these again fairly quickly. So in this slide, you see a little girl named Kylie. And Kylie got interested in insects because of a type 1 in her classroom. Her classroom teacher was very, very excited about science. And in her first grade classroom, she did a great unit on insects. Forward to the next slide. And here's Kylie, who in first grade also became really excited about insects. And Kylie decided she wanted to study ladybugs. So over the next year and a half, from first grade to third grade, she developed a ladybug game for little kids. What are ladybugs? How long do they live? How do they mate? And she had to learn all of these things, how to develop a board game, how to how to write the rules, how to start a small business, which by the way, she ended up with selling her game, next slide, to a major game developer in the US. Next slide. So Kylie learned these things, and then it worked so well for her. On the next slide, you'll see a copy of her game. And what you'll find is that it was very, very well done. So she had her teachers help her. She developed it for kids her age, little kids all the way up to second grade. And the next slide shows you some of the inside parts of the game. You can get this game in major US department stores. And this was done by a little girl who was in first grade. So think about this. Next slide. What matters in so many of these enrichment programs are the opportunities for students to pursue their interests, like Kylie did, the opportunities for them to make some kind of a difference. This is another little girl whose name is Caroline Mary, and she was out on the playground one day, and she realized that all around her, there were other students that couldn't go on the playground because they were in wheelchairs. There are 3 kids in her school in wheelchairs, and she wanted to develop a playground for students with disabilities. And so here you see her prototype. And again, this is what a type 3 is. Now, the next slide is a series of steps that we use to go to make a type 3. And again, this is Kylie's little invention. You see students on a little turnaround with students on wheelchairs who can participate in being turned around. The next slide illustrates the process of type 3 enrichment. We start with students with an idea in the middle, so they get a light bulb idea. They work with their teachers or someone in their school as a mentor, and they begin the development of their plan. We get them all kinds of resources, both material and human resources. And then over and over again, what we find is that students have fun. They work with somebody else, usually an adult, and this makes a tremendous difference. So we're going to now go to the next slide, which is an overview of Renzulli Learning. I would invite you to come to Renzulli Learning. This is a tool that we developed for teachers. And the tool that we developed for teachers, called again Renzulli Learning, is something that all students could use. If any of you want to try the profile, when students complete a profile and then they're matched with opportunities and enrichment that are in their areas of interest. And so they're matched with field trips and critical thinking activities and projects and opportunities for them to read ebooks online. And so this is a teacher helper to be able to do a good job at this. A couple of notes about, and again, please feel free to try it. There's free trials for you and your students, and you'll be able to do a profile for students too. Now, the next slide emphasizes something that's really important to us. And that is that in many cases with the longitudinal research that we've done on the school-wide enrichment model, in the next slide, you'll see that students' type 3 interests oftentimes influence their post-secondary plans. So because we've been around and doing this for quite a while, we've been able to see that students actually oftentimes major in college in an area of their type 3. So oftentimes, if they've done something in medicine, they go on to be doctors. If they've done something in engineering, they go on to be engineers. Our own daughter, who was a very, very talented drama student, went on to major in theater and television production. Exactly the focus of all of the type 3s that she did when she was in school in her school-wide enrichment model. I would also mention the next slide that SEM has been used with twice exceptional students and also used with students that are underachieving. So next slide, several studies showing that type 3 enrichment can be the way that we reverse underachievement. Next slide, when you have a chance, please. Not only reverse underachievement, but highlight for students opportunities to be able to move very, very expeditiously into doing something that they enjoy. So Susan Baum's study of using the enrichment triad model with students with learning disabilities shows that interests make a difference. Interests matter. In the next series of slides, we introduce the concept of enrichment clusters. This is a way to get started with the school-wide enrichment model in your school district. So in the next slide, you'll see the explanation of what enrichment clusters are. We provide, I'm going to a school this afternoon, actually, in Hartford, Connecticut, to see enrichment clusters. So this is an afternoon cluster at the end of the school day. All students leave their regular class. They're non-graded up to 2 or 3 grades. They go to a cluster. In this case, if you go to the next slide, you'll see the cluster is future creators and producers. It's a television cluster. But enrichment clusters enable all students to participate in enrichment, and they make a difference because all students get a chance to identify their interests and to be able to do the things that they want to do. So next slide. You'll see that we have oftentimes the school that I'm going to this afternoon is going to have probably 20 clusters for the 300 or 400 students. All teachers will be involved, and all students will be given the opportunity to do something in their area of interest. Next slide. In many cases, these enrichment clusters actually enable you to be able to do things that you always wanted to try and never had a chance to do. You can identify a problem. You can brainstorm solutions. And it also helps with social emotional growth. So in the next slide, you'll see just a summary of what we've learned. If you're working with other people on a project that's going to do something important, social emotional growth, for example, then lots of times you start to realize that this is what you want to do with your life. And so the next slide shows an enrichment cluster called Save Our Planet. And this is facilitated by a teacher with students from different classrooms who come together to solve a problem. Teachers aren't really teaching, they're more facilitating a group exploration. So you see this one, Save Our Planet, and the next one, Crime Scene Detectives, which is really also a huge hit in the US. People love, TV shows about this. The next 2 slides provide you with an overview of the major features of enrichment clusters. I'm not going to go through all of them because of time, but just to say this, teachers decide which clusters they want to do. Students decide which clusters they want to participate in. There are no lesson plans or unit plans. You don't write curriculum. Rather, you base your clusters around the interests of students. And so the next slide shows other basic features of enrichment clusters. And again, but the idea is that all students participate so that all students get some opportunities for type 1 and type 2 enrichment. There are hundreds of schools in the US that use enrichment clusters. We get to see them. As I said, Joe Renzulli and I are going to a school this afternoon. And again, in the next slide, you'll see there an opportunity for various types of enrichment. In this one, I love the next slide example, which is a little boy that started an enrichment cluster, started his own business to make buttons. And in this business that he made, a button making business, he actually raised money to buy materials, to mittens, gloves, hats for students that did not have enough money. So I would just summarize the next slide by saying that if you look online and you'll see many examples. If you just search enrichment clusters, as I do sometimes, I get to see schools all over the world that are using these. Exciting, happy, and students that are more advanced automatically go into, again, more advanced work, type 3 enrichment. So the next slide just tells you some of the research that's been done on the SEM. So we have many different summaries of research that have been done on the SEM. We use the SEM with various populations, with twice exceptional students, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. In many ways, what we've found in doing the research is that students with high levels of creative productivity, we have looked at type 3 enrichment, we've looked at longitudinal research, and what we found is that the school-wide enrichment model works. So next slide. It helps to reverse underachievement, and it provides opportunities for all students to be able to move forward. Okay, we're going to skip through some slides now so you can see some of the research findings. So there's research on enrichment clusters that I talked about earlier, showing how this works for all students. Next slide, please. There's research about special populations of students and curriculum compacting for students, as we mentioned. Next slide. You're going to also see some of the results of this work. This is the compactor form, the form of differentiation. And what you find is that student teachers are able to really challenge our gifted and talented students in SEM by using enrichment and school-wide enrichment. Next slide. So in addition to the research on compacting, which shows that some teachers could eliminate up to 50% of the content and students did just as well, we've learned that SEM works well with special populations. Next slide. And also that SEM works well at providing enrichment for a broader group of students. And those are the next few slides. So if you could just skip through the next few slides and let people take a look at this, I'll wait. And let's stop at the slide that says SEM works. We have multiple studies done on compacting, multiple studies done on longitudinal research. And so what have we learned? We've learned that SEM works. It's an exciting and new way of providing enrichment for all students, especially those, for example, that are twice exceptional. There's longitudinal research that shows that students benefit into college, and it works for teachers too. I'd like to just say that so much of teaching can be enjoyable when you're working with students on areas of strong interest. So these are the things we've learned. There are benefits for teachers as well. So next slide. SEM dedicated to doing things like this, to providing benefits for teachers, for providing enrichment. Next slide. For providing social and emotional growth, and most importantly, for putting students in a different role. And this is something that's critical. We're trying not to simply produce more students that learn lessons well. Next slide. But we want students that are going to become creative producers. This cartoon says this is a graduating high school class. And now the next award goes to the student voted best at filling in little circles on a number 2 pencil. These are the kind of computer tests we give. We are now watching the Nobel Prizes being announced this week. And what we know, and there's so many videos, please use these, look at these. These are opportunities for you to look at many different ways that SEM is implemented. All these are free. We have free online classes. But what we've learned, next slide, please, is that schools should be places for talent development. So schools, next slide, should be places for talent development, and that talents of all students should be developed. I'm going to wait 2 slides forward, please. These are the videos that I mentioned that are available on SEM. There are hundreds of them online. And the next slide summarizes what I just said. Schools should be places for talent development. All students should have some time to develop their talents. And how do we do this? In the next slide, just shows the thing that we have learned most in our 40 years. We develop talents in students' areas of interest always by giving them opportunities, resources, and encouragement in areas of interest. So opportunities, resources, and encouragement in areas of interest. Next slide. I'd love to be able to show you this little guy in person. This is the little boy that developed. And just look at his face. And that's what we want. We want more opportunities for students to develop talents. So the SEM is a talent development approach. Everything that we've developed is on our website, free. On the next slide, you'll see some examples of, we offer free courses on the SEM. If any of you are interested, they are in English, but if any of you are interested, we put our PowerPoints up, we put our videos up, and we are very proud of what we've done over these years. So in summary, schools should be, you can turn off this if you want now and just go to my face. Schools should be places for talent development. We should potentially and more often give students the opportunity for talent development. We can give all students some type of opportunity to be engaged and interested in enrichment by doing type 1s through enrichment clusters. But there are 3 major services in the school-wide enrichment model, 3, and you've heard about all 3 of them. If you're interested in any more of them, please visit our website. And I hope you'll see why this is one of the most frequently used models for gifted education across the globe, but also why it's used for twice exceptional students, because we want to give opportunities for strength-based learning and development of talents in all students. Thank you very much.